book called The Case Against Academic Boycotts of Israel. He is also a poet and is working, he was just telling us over dinner, on a book of poetry which includes poems from Germany and Japan and Britain and the United States and others during World War II. He also has an anthology of contemporary poetry. He wrote a book entitled No University is an Island, Saving Academic Freedom. Another one, Revolutionary Memory, Recovering the Poetry of the American Left. And an interesting title, Manifesto of a Tenured Radical. So he's kind of a prolific writer and has done many things. And of course, the reason he's here today is for many of us who support Palestinian statehood and an end to Israeli occupation of the West Bank. One of the methods that's been used increasingly is to have academic boycotts of Israeli universities and Israeli scholars. And Professor Cary Nelson has strong feelings about that, has just co-edited a book about that. So we are eager to hear you and have a lively discussion with question and answers, and we welcome your questions and comments, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion once the lecture is done. So thank you for coming to us in this weather, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Gail. It's in today's vibrant world, I arrive here to meet people for the first time that I've had internet relationships with for months. And it's always very strange, but it's great to actually see some live human beings which have some small benefits over purely cyber identities. It's in talking about BDS, I find it helpful, actually it may be necessary, to begin talking about the political situation in Israel and the West Bank before addressing the kind of challenges that BDS presents to those of us in the United States. What I'm not going to do is what almost everyone else does. I'm not going to offer you an emotional appeal on behalf of either side. The entry for discussions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is usually to try to reach out to your feelings for one side or another. I know what the list is. I'm not going to dramatize how small a country Israel is, how vulnerable its citizens on its border are, how narrow the country's waist is, how anti-Semitic Israel's neighbors are, how demoralizing and terrifying the suicide bombings were. Nor am I going to testify to how wretched the lives of Palestinians in the refugee camps are, how frustrating it is for them to face constant police surveillance, how galling the checkpoints can be when the flow of people, Palestinians coming to work or move, is stalled, how counterproductive IDF policies like the destructions of homes are. So I take these lists of factual lists for granted, but I don't pay the entry fee of trying to work up your sense of injustice and victimhood for one side or the other. I think empathy for both peoples is critical to any viable solution to the conflict. But political agitation, which is often accentuated by trying to make an emotional appeal to you for one side or another, does not help us move toward a just peace. It does not. Pro and con campus debates about BDS or the Arab-Israeli conflict often amount to competing efforts to win people over to one side or the other emotionally. And I call that war by other means. The Jews have an ancient and irrevocable bond with the land of Israel. Judaism is a religion founded and created in a place, and it retains that physical connection. I also believe the world owed the Jews a revived homeland in the wake of the Holocaust. Moreover, half of Israel's current population descended from Jews who fled Arab countries in 1948. They can hardly be credited to European colonialism. The Palestinians, too, have historical connections with the land. But they're not an indigenous people comparable to American Indians or Australian Aborigines. that claim, when it's made, is basically designed to delegitimate the Jewish bond with the land. Palestinians, moreover, were not a people at all when the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917 or when the war broke out in 1948. But they have become a people in the intervening years, a people with rights, needs, and now valid territorial claims. When we say there are two competing and often really irreconcilable narratives about Arab and Israeli history, it's worth adding, I think, that both narratives, both the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian narrative, have a core of truth. They also both have distortion. But there can never be a just peace without compromise and concessions from both sides. In my view, that will entail abandonment of most Israeli settlements east of the security barrier or fence, and it's going to require some form of division for Jerusalem so there can be a Palestinian capital there. The barrier or fence or wall, whatever you want to call it, most of it's a fence actually, I don't see it simply as a deterrent to suicide bombers, which it obviously has been, but I also see it as a great boon to the Palestinians because it's a potential political border. It's a line, it marks a line where one country could end and another country could begin, where a Palestinian state could end and the Israeli state begins. Perhaps the most notable evidence in support of my view is that settlers east of the wall in the West Bank know well that the wall looms as a potential destination for Israeli withdrawal, which is why settlers see the wall as a threat. They don't see it as a protection for them. They see it as a danger to their settlements. So I see it as a reason for hope. It's often castigated on American campuses, and I think that represents a real failure to understand its political utility. Any Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, however, will have to be accompanied either by a negotiated agreement that the Palestinian state will be demilitarized, that is, forbidden to acquire offensive weapons or offensive capabilities, or by a firm Israeli declaration that it reserves the right to destroy offensive weapons capacities should they materialize. And I retain perhaps a naive faith that with good jobs, satisfactory housing, the ability to raise families, confidence in the capacity for self-governance, most Palestinians will choose peace rather than war. That will require serious economic development for both the West Bank and Gaza, and it will require very carefully monitored investment both from Arab states in the region and from the West. I believe some Hamas fighters will eventually choose peace, though some may face violent rejection from their own people. I don't have much confidence that either the current Israeli or Palestinian leaders are negotiating in good faith, and I don't have much confidence in their personal courage. If pressure is to be applied, both sides should receive it. Demonizing either people will not help. International aid to the Palestinians should be carefully monitored so none is devoted to military preparation. Substantial pressure should be applied to end settlement construction east of the wall. Housing built west of the wall should be considered politically irrelevant because everyone knows that the thin sliver of territory to the west of the wall is going to be retained by Israel and there'll have to be land swaps to account for it. The international debate tends now to respond with the same kind of rage and hyperbole and anger to settlement construction, whether it simply means adding housing units west of the wall or building east of the wall. And I would like to see a curtailment of settlements east of the wall, and I think people should just give up caring about settlement construction west of the wall. The distinction is very hard to make in the current political atmosphere. So, whether you agree with all of those principles or not, doesn't matter. I lay them out so you know where I stand. the fundamental next question is, what does the BDS movement, as a movement, offer to this scenario? That is, what does BDS give us as a way of advancing these goals? The movement begins with what appear to be a series of just demands, written as simple, straightforward principles that faculty and students are often eager to endorse. Unfortunately, it's not always quite so easy to solve complex political problems. Worse still, BDS's brief, unqualified principles mean very different things to different people, to different groups. Because BDS demands are crafted in such broad, vague generalities, people who endorse them often feel free to interpret them in any way they want. But any international treaty, any local agreement would have to be far more specific. Some of the implications of BDS demands might be accepted. Others would be vigorously disputed. In fact, they'd be disputed to the point of open war. So, these are life and death matters. People have lost their lives over how to put these principles into practice. And it's particularly ironic to ask academics to support principles without having any idea what those principles actually mean in practice. Yet that's largely what the movement asks people to do. So just to take the most obvious example, what does it mean to say that Israel must, quote, end its occupation of all Palestinian land? Sounds fair enough. Their land, you're occupying it, get out. But precisely what land is being referred to? Beginning in the 19th century and leading up to the founding of Israel in 48, Jews settled in Palestine after buying land when it was up for sale. Some people feel Jews should not have been allowed to buy land from Arabs, but most Americans respect deeds of ownership, and they think that if you sell your house to somebody, they then own it. That's the way we operate. And most Americans would not agree to have their own deeds arbitrarily overthrown. When the United Nations partitioned Palestine to create the State of Israel, it added to what would become Israel by granting Jews title to public land once owned by the failed, disintegrated Ottoman Empire. In 48, the surrounding Arab states went to war to overturn the UN's partition and drive Jews into the sea. But they failed, and Israel expanded its borders as a consequence. Those revised borders from 1949, have very broad international acceptance. Yet a number of BDS's most prominent leaders, along with key Palestinian groups, don't accept them and consider everything from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River to be Palestinian land. So what does Palestinian land mean when the BDS says leave the occupied Palestinian land? Is it only what Israel conquered in the 1967 war? One, the largest parcel, the Sinai Peninsula, has been returned to Egypt as a consequence of a peace treaty. And of course, in 2006, Israel withdrew from Gaza as well. When Israel gained control of the West Bank, it had territory that Jordan had controlled since 48. For some, the West Bank is what people mean by Palestinian land. BDS as a movement leaves that dangerously unspecified. Although BDS has taken no position on the other most controversial demand, which is for a right of return to Israel for Palestinian refugees, once again, all of its major spokespersons actually support that principle. So on the one hand, you have a movement on his website, they say, you know, we don't take an official position on whether Palestinians and their millions of descendants should be allowed to return, but everyone who speaks for the movement says, I personally support that. Ditto with the one state, two state controversy. BDS takes no official position. Its spokespersons all say, we believe Israel should be eliminated and there should be one state dominated by an Arab population. So both PLO and Hamas also insist that all the descendants of those who left, fled, or were forced out of what became Israel in 1948 have the right to return, which amounts to millions of people. Perhaps only 50,000 of the people who actually left are still alive, or fewer, but there are millions of their descendants who could be involved in a right of return. Of course, one of the odd things is that in 1948, not only did 700,000 Palestinians flee or leave Israel, 700,000 Jews fled or left Arab countries because of Israel's founding and settled in Israel. What's odd is that the number is about the same, and more than half of Israel's current residents are actually descendants of those Jews who fled Arab countries, since they really had no choice once Israel itself was founded. BDS likes to proclaim that its boycott efforts answered the call of Palestinian civil society because a series of non-government organizations urged support for a boycott in 2005. But many of those organizations are formally committed to delegitimizing and ending the Israeli state. And there's no real basis for BDS to inflate their request by acting like all of Palestinian society supported support for a boycott, since the Palestinian Authority itself, the government of the Palestinians, doesn't support a boycott resolution. And indeed, the Palestinian Authority has put on trial some people who interrupted events with pro-boycott demonstrations. In doing so, the Palestinian Authority is arguably echoing the sentiments of its population. An April 2014 poll of West Bank Palestinians asked them a question. Would you rather have more jobs in Israel, more employment by Israeli firms, or fewer? And 65% of Palestinian residents said they'd rather have more jobs with Israeli employers, perhaps because the Israeli employers pay about twice as much, and it's a little easier to live on twice the salary. Given all these contradictions, and given the lack of support in the West Bank itself for academic boycotts, for general boycotts, BDS has sought a softer target, and that softer target is you. They've sought your support for boycotting Israeli universities and cultural institutions. And sometimes students and faculty are gullible in signing on to this project. The BDS call for academic boycotts is fraught with contradictions and misrepresentations of fact. For example, while the standard BDS demands is that Israeli faculty not be allowed to attend conferences in the United States if their travel is paid for by their university, which of course it always is. I think there are probably very few faculty members here who would like to see travel support for their conference attendance ended. I think they wouldn't go anymore. But some of BDS's supporters say actually Israelis can continue to attend conferences in the United States as long as they pay for the trips themselves. And someone like Judith Butler says that means that BDS is supporting academic freedom, because the faculty members from Israel have the right to attend the conferences. They're free to do that as long as they pay their own way. I don't think actually that endorses academic freedom, which includes your right to find funds to support your travel. And those of you who are studying the sciences probably know that in order to publish articles in science journals, you're typically assigned a page fee. And if you're a scientist, that could be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for one essay. Many scientists publish many essays in a year, so start getting up to $10,000, $15,000. It's a real expense. Universities or grants in the US pay for those page fees. Scientists don't pay them themselves. The same thing is true in Israel. The government or grants pay those page fees. So BDS says Israeli academics aren't prohibited from publishing in US journals, but they have to pay the page fees themselves. So they pay their travel costs themselves, pay their page fees themselves. This is not a generous arrangement. Worse still would be the damage done to important institutional collaborations between Americans, Israelis, and Arabs on subjects like alternative energy, desalinization, water-restricted agriculture. All these research areas are critical to any Palestinian state. Israel now gets 40% of its water from desalinization. An incredible statistic. It's salt water that has the salt extracted from it. There's not going to be successful Palestinian agriculture without desalinization. Indeed, there should be more research on it to improve it. And unsurprisingly, Palestinian scientists like to work with Israeli scientists on that desalinization research, right? It's vital to their lives and to their possibility of having a Palestinian state. BDS wants to prohibit those collaborations. It affects you. BDS argues that if there are study abroad programs in Israel, or if there are joint degree programs, a number of which exist between American and Israeli universities, they should all be closed down. And BDS makes the remarkable argument that demand to close down those programs is not an attack on people, it's just an attack on institutions. But, maybe I'm naive, but I always thought that it was students who participate in study abroad programs and people who participated in collaborative research projects or joint degree programs. They aren't typically, they don't recruit robots or alien visitors for them. They recruit you. And if the programs are closed down, your freedom of choice is curtailed. You don't get to make those kind of choices. And, it's hardly a mystery that a large percentage of the people who go to study abroad programs in Israel are Jews. Not all, but many are. And so it really is discriminatory against those students specifically to have those programs closed down. None of these arrangements could survive a fully implemented academic boycott, nor can the dialogue with Israeli academic critics of the Israeli government policy survive an academic boycott. I engaged in many of those face-to-face dialogues with Israeli faculty while Iron Dome was destroying rockets overhead in July. All of those conversations were institutionally funded. My thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was given a rigorous and detailed critique by Israeli faculty. So boycott if you will, but I'm not willing to give up those conversations. I learned from them, I'm challenged by them. But everything I've said so far ignores the single worst thing about the BDS movement. And that's because it actually offers nothing to the Palestinian people it purports to champion. Political initiatives need to champion practical steps devoted toward establishing two steps for two peoples. Boycotts do nothing except demonize one country. They don't propose a series of logical political steps to move us toward a solution of the conflict. When BDS leaders like Omar Barghouti and Judith Butler call furthermore for the dissolution of the Jewish state, they're promoting a fantasy that the overwhelming majority of Israelis will simply never accept. That fantasy may promote feelings of self-aggrandizement amongst American faculty and students, but it doesn't serve the end of achieving a Palestinian state where Palestinians can control their own destiny. The BDS movement hardens hearts on both sides, discourages productive cross-cultural contacts, and seems mainly to make Americans feel good about themselves. We're on the side of justice and right, but that doesn't necessarily help anybody. The same American students and faculty might be well devoted to criticizing U.S. foreign policy and trying to change it, including pressuring Israelis more severely to end settlement expansion east of the security barrier. Now, the BDS movement is the Western arm of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACBI, P-A-C-B-I. That's the group. Who's that? That's the That's a slightly shorter talk than I was planning for.
Otherwise, we do have a hand.
Low battery.
It's not ideal, but it's necessary. I didn't do this in some
Let's try this. All right. I'll do this. Okay. This July, apologize for that exciting interruption. Something to tell your children about. This July, POCB issued much more detailed guidelines for boycotts than it ever had before. And those boycotts are you can be replaced, you know. First of all, POCB points out that universities in Israel are justified to be boycotted because they haven't taken formal positions in opposition to government policy, like universities in the United States. Israeli universities are involved in government-sponsored research and receive government funds to support students. But we don't expect universities here to speak for you or take a stand and say, you know, Michigan State University is formally opposed to any more funding for Ann Arbor, right? They leave it to you to express your feelings and your opinions. We don't expect universities to speak for us on political matters. We want our freedom to speak for ourselves. Plus, in case you're interested, if universities in the US did that, they would be violating their tax status as public charities, 501c3s. So I don't think they're going to do it, no matter how loud people demand it. So why would one expect Israeli universities to take institutional stands in opposition to the policy of the government if we don't expect universities to do it anywhere else? Then POCB in its new guidelines adds one other remarkable statement to that. It says Israeli universities should be considered guilty unless proven otherwise. So, by the way, if our legal system worked on the guilty unless proven innocent, it might be a little inconvenient for people who in fact didn't commit a crime. Yeah, definitely one more time, and you know, you look for further employment.
He's a volunteer.
That's under capitalism. If you don't pay people under capitalism,
this is why I failed.
Right? You just don't get good work for free. I mean, that's one of the lessons. Obviously, that may be the best lesson you get out of this talk.
It's not his fault. It's my fault. I'm bringing batteries.
So guilty unless proven innocent, right? It's not a principle that I think Americans really should be willing to support.
Here we go. I'll try it again.
We're there. All right, thank you. Will now double his salary. Easy for us to do since he isn't getting anything. So next, demonizing Israel and singling it out for this kind of criticism and this kind of demand in a region already overburdened by religious and secular hatred really accomplishes nothing toward advancing the goals of peace. PACMI now goes further. It condemns all events, projects, or publications that are designed to bring Palestinians, Arabs, and Israelis together so that they can share their respective views or work for reconciliation. Those are some of the most important things that happen in the Middle East. Bringing young students together, bringing older Israelis and Palestinians together, and having them talk to one another, learn something about one another. I've visited 2 of those projects in Israel, and they were really quite wonderful. Bringing young students in, bringing Palestinian and Israeli teachers in, and having them work together in classrooms. Little kids taught each other their games from the different cultures, and that kind of empathy and that kind of understanding can really make a huge contribution. What PACMI now says is relationships like that can only be created if the effort to bring them together is founded on the desire to eliminate the state of Israel. Well, that's really not a way of building collaborative relationships between Arabs and Israelis. They say coexistence, to use their term, should not be the goal. What should be the goal is co-resistance. In other words, antagonism. In the end, it's not just a matter of resisting policy, but of ending the state itself. Years of efforts by BDS have persuaded a significant number of students that Israel is a kind of rogue nation deserving unqualified condemnation. It promotes a dichotomy. Israel is unjust. Justice resides only with the Palestinian side of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And once again, that rejects rational discussion and reasonable interchanges. It encourages opponents of Israel, students and faculty, to see themselves as something like shining warriors in the international struggle for human rights. That ignores the fact that Israel is the only country in the Middle East that guarantees those rights for all its citizens, rights it does not guarantee for the Palestinian residents of the West Bank. Peter Beinart uses the phrase, which I find helpful, democratic Israel and undemocratic Israel, and my desire is to see Israel abandon undemocratic Israel and give it to the Palestinians. This brew of self-righteousness is very dangerous if what you're looking for in your life is a way to embrace a cause designed to improve your self-esteem by convincing you you are part of a selfless movement. Self-esteem increased, enhanced by the fantasy of selflessness. In addition to the tragic fact that BDS offers no concrete hope to the Palestinians, it therefore works as a kind of bait-and-switch strategy. Draw you into its movement that identifies itself as fighting for justice, and then convincing you that there is an evil country in the Middle East that needs to be dissolved. When I listed all those reasons why BDS, despite the claims that it denies its aim is to boycott individuals, that's because BDS movement knows that you actually don't want to seek to do damage to individual human beings, that makes you uncomfortable. So they claim that they don't do it. The July 2014, a favorite document of mine, begins this way, quote, "While an individual's academic freedom should be fully and consistently respected, an individual academic, Israeli or otherwise, cannot be exempt from common sense boycotts." So in the same sentence, they say your academic freedom should be protected, and then conclude the sentence by saying, but you could be individually boycotted, and the new rules list the ways and reasons why you could, as an individual, be boycotted. A series of other demands are added. It says faculty and students shouldn't publish in journals based at Israeli universities. PACMI also says that U.S. journals should refuse to reprint articles first published in Israel. If they're first published in Israel, we should refuse to reprint them. That initiates an extraordinary blacklisting of Israeli authors whose articles couldn't be readily seen in the United States. And it amounts to an assault on the academic freedom we've believed in for over 100 years. Huckabee adds that faculty members should not agree to write letters of recommendation for students who want to study in Israel. And that's been part of your academic freedom to ask for such letters and for faculty to write them for as long as I've been alive. They characterize programs of study at Israeli University as nothing more than schemes. And they argue that students should be boycotted if they accept fellowships from pro-Israeli organizations in the United States. It's really, I can actually go on listing more of these things, but I think you probably get the sense that they now are elaborately directed toward doing harm to individual people. They say that if you visit an Israeli university, then you should be prevented from visiting a Palestinian university afterwards, because that would give the illusion that these were equivalent institutions, whereas in fact, Palestinian universities are oppressed. If you listen to all of these prescriptions, I think you have to acknowledge that if you try to put this into practice all across the country, you'd have a chaos of ways to actually realize it. There'd be contradictory practices. The idea that everyone could put all this into effect in the same way is simply impossible. BDS's major spokesperson in the United States is Omar Barghouti, and its premier philosopher is Judith Butler. I actually am a fan of a lot of Judith Butler's work on gender. I've assigned it to classes over and over again. But her numerous essays and one book on Israel are, I believe, fundamentally irrational and destructive. She's the premier philosopher of BDS in the United States. She's first of all opposed to the existence of a Jewish state because she believes nation-states will soon disappear from the earth, that nationalism is an outdated movement, and we're going to see states, including the United States, dissolve. Well, I don't think you're going to see it happen too soon. What's interesting is that unlike most BDS advocates, and many of whom believe the day of the nation state is going to end soon, she doesn't ignore the contradiction that she's asking for a Palestinian state. At the same time, she says that all the states in the world should dissolve. But her answer to this contradiction, I must say, generates at least a little bit of amusement in me, because she says, we can't oppose a Palestinian state because they haven't had one yet. So all existing states could go, but they haven't had one, so we shouldn't oppose it. She's also steadfastly committed to a belief that BDS is a completely nonviolent movement. Once again, actually, she has the courage to realize that there's a little germ of worry there. Because if every BDS spokesperson says the Israeli state should come to an end, exactly how are you going to get there nonviolently, right? I think you might find that there are quite a few Israelis who'd be willing to take up arms if you try to bring their state to an end. She actually does have an answer, and I actually do think the answer crosses the line into lunacy. A mild condemnation, to be sure. Look, it comes down to this. What she says is that the Jews have been a people scattered over the earth for centuries. They've been persecuted, they've been cast out of countries, cast out of England and Spain for hundreds of years. The Jews have been a people without a home. And she says that's who they fundamentally are. They should look into their hearts and realize that they don't actually want a home. They're homeless, that's who they are. And so they should willingly give up the state of Israel, because if they really understood who they are as a people, they would understand that they were a people destined to wander the earth and never have a home. Well, I think part of what amazes me about that nonsense is that she has actually been to Israel. She's walked through Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, you know, amazing cities with cultural institutions and nightclubs and Jerusalem, an ancient city that's thousands of years old. The idea that people are going to sort of just like say, well, what the hell, we never wanted it anyway, we'll get back on boats and sail back to Germany and Poland where they love us. I mean, she's trying to find a way of justifying the BDS claim that Israel can be ended as a Jewish state non-violently. Well, the only thing she can come up with is this, well, whatever you want to call it, idea that if the Jews really understood themselves, they'd just get the hell out and leave it to somebody else. I really don't think that's a rational argument. And it's basically a kind of metaphysical notion. It's an abstract idea that she's worked out in her head that I think just has no relationship to reality. If this is the best that BDS can actually offer by way of a peaceful transition to one state with an Arab majority, then I think we can be sure that if the first step to getting there is to boycott Israeli universities, there's no use to the movement. Fairness for both peoples means political self-determination for each, not a BDS route through the obliteration of Jewish rights. And that takes us to the central question that plagues the BDS movement. Is it anti-Semitic? One has to quote Larry Summers, a man whom in most respects I despise, but I'll cut him a little slack on this particular point, where he suggested that divestment movements were anti-Semitic in their effect, even if they weren't anti-Semitic in their intent. And I think that's still a useful model in thinking about BDS. Doesn't mean that every divestment proposal is anti-Semitic. Doesn't mean that people who argue for BDS are anti-Semitic. I never make that claim because I don't know what's in people's hearts. People often don't know what's in their hearts, let alone anyone else knowing. But I do think that people who argue for the elimination of Israel as a Jewish state are promoting a goal that has anti-Semitic effects. One would add that some BDS advocates assure us that if you ended the Jewish state, but Jews decided to still live there under Arab domination, that they would live peacefully and safely and have full religious freedom. And I simply ask you, look at the region and find me Arab states that offer true religious freedom to Jews, Christians, or anybody else. There's no prior history in the region to suggest that that is in any way plausible. It's hard to believe that that naivety is fully explains such a denial of reality. Perhaps BDS advocates really don't care what would happen to Jews in an Arab-dominated state. I'm sure that BDS gathers some anti-Semites into its fold, and the way that it assigns pariah status to Jews to the Israeli state is troubling. But I think most BDS advocates are simply naive and don't understand that the movement is generating anti-Semitic effects without really making it clear to people. What's in your heart? You really can only answer that by asking yourselves. I can't answer it for you. No one can answer it for you. But I think if you see that a movement spreads stereotypes and spreads hatred, it's worth asking yourself what it means for you to align yourself with it. Helen Fine's 1987 definition of anti-Semitism was a persisting latent structure of hostile beliefs toward Jews as a collectivity, and along with Larry Summers' statement, I think those offer good places to begin trying to think about this question, which upsets many in academia. They get semi-hysterical. And of course, that hostility is often focused on the single most demonized term in the BDS lexicon, Zionism. Zionism as a movement has had dozens of definitions over the years, but in the current political climate, all that it necessarily means is that Jews have a right to have a state in the area of Palestine. If you call yourself a Zionist, certainly on the American left, you often have no one who will listen to you, even if you believe Israel should withdraw from the occupied territories. You're still a blind ideologue. Absolute opposition to Israel's existence increases anti-Semitism, cultural and political reach and impact. Indeed, anti-Semitism is a fundamental condition of possibility for unqualified opposition to the Jewish state. Thus, anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism's moral salvation, its perfect disguise, its route to legitimation. We owe it to ourselves and our colleagues and our history to lift the prohibition against confronting the anti-Semitic underbelly of the BDS movement. That effort won't be welcome. It's certainly not welcome from me, but I urge you to commit yourself to the pursuit of the truth. Thanks. So I'm going to do questions as a kind of fireside chat in a chair, and my practice is to take as many as you've got. As long as it takes. Sure. Yeah. Go ahead, in the back. Yeah. Should we pass that handheld mic around?
Sure. Is that a battery?
Oh, okay. So stand up and project.
I'll try to speak loud. Is this recorded? Is this the idea? That's why you wanted the mic. I'll try to speak loud. I thank you very much for the lecture. I don't know yet where I stand on BDS. I'm conflicted, and so it was very interesting to me to hear a lot of the points you raised because it's things I never thought about. I wanted to present two.
That's why I was here, so I'm glad it worked that way.
I wanted to present two brief questions. The first is, it is perhaps my false impression that BDS is partly based on the precedent of using boycott to fight apartheid in South Africa, various forms of boycott. And I don't know if you were against that then, or if you think these are different situations, but I wonder if you could talk more about that precedent, because I think many people supported then the end of apartheid and using boycotts and divestment to end apartheid. I think that's the model for BDS. So that's one question, that precedent. The second question is, I think that, how shall I put this? What if I accept the argument that you're making, which is that BDS is actually a denial of academic freedom, and does constitute in various ways an attack on individual people? But I tell you, you're right, but that's less important than the cause. It takes secondary priority to what's more important here, which is pushing the Israeli state or the Israeli public toward making concessions. I think that's an argument one can make. I don't know. So these are my two.
Yeah, they're both good questions. Of course, I supported the boycott of South Africa. The organization I was president of, the AUP for 6 years, also supported the boycott of South Africa. I think you can have a long discussion of it. Maybe just offer a couple of points. That was a comprehensive economic boycott against all South African industries, against all South African products. It obviously also had an impact on South African universities, right? Because they were boycotted as well, but it didn't single out universities. It wasn't an academic boycott, it was a comprehensive boycott. It had certain conditions in reality that it was responding to. First of all, that a minority white population was actually denying basic rights to a majority black population. In Israel itself, Israel proper, 1960, pre-1967 boundaries, both Jews and Arabs have constitutional rights. There's discrimination against Arabs. It's being slowly worked at, but it needs to be worked at much more quickly. I've met Israeli Arabs, I've met a number of them, and they're angry. They feel that they deserve better housing, better educational opportunities, better infrastructure in the towns that they live in. But what they don't want is Israel to be dissolved as a country. They want to retain that country and the rights and benefits that Israeli citizens have. They just want a better deal than they're getting now. And I think it's terribly important that Israel make those changes and end discrimination of its Arab citizens. So South Africa, you had a majority black population suppressed that supported that boycott because they wanted the white power structure overthrown. So there's nothing comparable in Israel that would justify that. Israel is, creating conditions for West Bank Palestinians that are unacceptable. But the aim with South Africa was to bring the South African state to an end. That was the only way to bring freedom and rights to the black majority. The aim of the West Bank is just to get Israel the hell out of there so that Palestinians can have their own state. Now, there's some conditions that need to be attached to that, but I think that's the goal. Now, you could ask this question, and I think it's fair. Should there be ways both of pressuring the Israeli government and pressuring the Palestinian government to negotiate with greater commitment and greater honesty? And I think the answer to that is probably yes, but I don't have, sorry to say, a great deal of confidence or faith either in Israel or the Palestinian Authority's current leadership. I just don't know that they have the political will or the courage to negotiate in the way they need to. So what I think is important, the priority, should be to end settlement construction for Israel east of the wall, because every settlement that's expanded undercuts the possibility for a two-state solution. So no matter what you think of the Netanyahu government or the odds that it would possibly bring about a two-state solution, if you can end that excess settlement construction, at least you're not putting barriers to a future government making settlements, making a peace agreement. And every time a settlement is expanded east of the barrier, you undercut what a future Israeli government can do, or what a future Palestinian government should do. So, in practical terms, I think that's the pressure that should be placed, and I think the U.S. government needs to do more of that, and we need to, encourage our government to do more of that. If I were to put pressure on the Palestinian Authority, my suggestion is that all financial aid given to the Palestinian Authority should be carefully monitored, tracked, and accounted for. So it doesn't go into any private bank accounts, so it isn't diverted to military purposes. I think they get a lot of aid. I think the aid should be monitored much more thoroughly than it is now, and that's perhaps a form of pressure that might move them toward negotiating more honestly. Well, I would like to see pressure put on both, not just on one. Now, the other question was, is there a higher goal that would warrant dismissing the danger that academic boycotts have for academic freedom, and should we act in service of that goal? Look, the AAUP for years has rejected all academic boycotts. It does so for several reasons. First of all, it's a slippery slope. You want to boycott this university, someone else will want to boycott another university. Any set of values that will justify boycotting one institution are not going to hold. It then becomes a process whereby you boycott universities in multiple countries. So first of all, it's a slippery slope. Second of all, in many countries, including Israel, faculty members and students are the most severe critics of their country's policy. So you're not boycotting the Israeli military, you're boycotting the critics of Israeli policy, the people whom you most want to have dialogue with and learn from. So academic boycotts are counterproductive. They limit dialogue with the very people that you benefit most from talking with. And finally, in Israel, an academic boycott does just as much harm to Palestinians as it does to Israelis. University of Haifa, a third of its undergraduates are Palestinians. In Israel's medical colleges, 22% of the people training to be doctors are Palestinian Arabs. I mean, it's a pretty broad brush where you do harm to both sets of peoples and you do real harm to Palestinians. So, and I could go on listing reasons why academic boycotts of Israel are counterproductive, but that gives you some of them. If you want to serve the higher goal, why are you doing this to serve it? What is it? What is help? What higher? What actual practical movement toward the goal of a Palestinian state does messing with Israeli universities do? I just don't see what it does. Yeah.
I have a question in regards to this pressure you're speaking about, how the U.S. government can put pressure on these great conflicts and bring some resolution to them. Back in the 80s in Cincinnati, I was Cincinnatian, I was a teacher in the Jewish wards. We used to have something in the school districts because of ethnic conflicts. And there was a sort of a fork or slang where a teacher would hear something that's anti-Semitic, and we would call it a Jewish allergy, okay? And we would literally write a report, because that's Cincinnati, and there's some very historical Jewish wards there, and we would engage in pressures from the teachers, especially those of us who had any Jewish identity, for what's called cultural exchanges. And we did it in family groups, and we did it in the school district. It was mandatory. And some of it came out of the Boston lawsuits for cultural exchanges. Now we're dealing with this Palestine, the Arabs, and the Israeli. I'm wondering, is there somehow, some way, that there's a mandatory cultural exchange if the Palestinians are required to go to this school, or if the Palestinians want citizenship? Has that happened, or is that going to happen, or is it something the U.S. government talking about?
There are great small programs to put people in relationship to one another. I mentioned that I spent a day visiting with one of them and half a day visiting with another. And my problem, frankly, is that those programs to bring Palestinians and Israelis together don't actually receive much of any government support. They're all funded by NGOs, non-government organizations around the world, and they could be much, much larger. So one of them, the one for elementary school kids that I just love, deals with about 500 kids a year, which is, for a small country, significant. Half of them Jews, half of them Arabs, but they would be capable of tripling the size of their program or quadrupling it if they had more money. So the problem with those programs is that they're small and they're underfunded. They really need to be expanded. There's some other things that can be done. Palestinians, Arabs in Israel made a choice to have their own schools rather than to have schools together with Israeli children. They have a choice. They chose it. Palestinians, the Arabs in Israel, in their schools, are required to learn Hebrew, which makes sense, but Jews in their schools are not required to learn Arabic. And I think that requirement would go a certain distance toward building understanding between the two peoples. Now, it's good for the Israeli Arabs to be required to learn Hebrew because that's the dominant language of the country, and that's a route toward financial health, a route toward good careers, and so forth. But the other requirement, if it were instituted, would build understanding between the two peoples. That would be quite revolutionary for Israel, but at least I think it's an idea of something you could do to build more empathy and understanding. And I think those NGOs around the world that support those kind of empathy-building collaborations ought to devote more money to them. Because I think in the long run, that's like the way to go. That, especially some of the kids who've been in those programs are tracked for a long time afterwards. And in the one that I spent the full day with, which was in Jerusalem, some of the teachers in that program graduated from it as kids 20 years ago. They've now returned to teach in it. They returned to volunteer in it. So there's really some evidence that even an early year program like that can make a lifetime difference in how you feel about the other people. people. They're really quite inspiring, and there are people who devoted themselves to those programs for many, many years. More of them, more investment in them, it really could make a big difference. Back again.
Sure. As someone sort of just with like a lack of background understanding of the BDS movement writ large, I thought the talk was really salient on 2 points. One sort of just being the counterproductiveness of sort of academic boycotts, and then second on some of the macro political institutional level changes that need to occur for the peace process to be successful. And in that regard, this question might be a little narcissistic, but I guess just wondering, as you sort of pointed out, I think one of the
students are required to be narcissistic. I think it's,
it's
part of the degree requirement.
I think you do a really good job pointing out how some of the appeal of the BDS movement is tied to individual students like myself or others who sort of want to change Israeli-Palestinian relations and make a difference. I guess what is sort of an alternative avenue or a more successful means of sort of facilitating that macro level change that I really agree with you sort of present from an American student perspective?
Well, I think there's several things. First of all, educating yourselves about the historical realities, learning more about Israeli history, learning more about the history of the Palestinian people, becoming, emissaries in your community for knowledge. Because I think that's sort of what university should be about. Then I think encouraging civil dialogue on campus. I won't have, on this matter, I will not have an argument with anybody. Sorry. I'm just not going to have an argument. It doesn't get anybody anywhere. I will talk rationally. I have deep feelings as well. Just don't put them into play because I don't think it actually helps. So, becoming better educated, promoting good conversations and dialogue on campus, when possible, visiting the Middle East. It makes a huge difference to see the place. It's not always easy to get to the West Bank, especially at the moment. It looks a little risky, but I've spent a bit of time on the West Bank, and it really doesn't help much to think of the West Bank as a map or to think of it just as abstract space. If you went there, you'd be quite surprised. First of all, most of it's empty. People complain it's only a small space, but most of it is quite desert-like, or at least very arid, could be changed by the addition of water, and there's a lot of space for people to live. There are a lot of places where you could build cities. It could be a valid state for the Palestinian people. There's a wonderful project called Rawabi that I visited on the West Bank. There's a lot of hills in the West Bank, and towns and small cities tend to be built on one hill, right? City on the hill. Rawabi is a Palestinian city on a hill. It was built with a lot of money from Qatar, millions and millions of dollars, which from Qatar is like lunch money, but still it matters. And they wanted to design an ideal city. From the scratch, what would a perfect city be like? And of course they quarried limestone from the area, which is standard Israeli and West Bank architecture. And then they built these beautiful apartment buildings. They built social spaces, wonderful gymnasiums, theaters. There's an outdoor open air theater that looks like a huge version of a Greek theater, tiers of seats. Everything you could want. And it's designed to be a city focused on high tech. So software development, computer development, to attract Palestinians working in those areas, along with some folks to clean up and serve food and things like that. And it's not, obviously because it's focused on high-tech industry, it's not going to be a solution for everybody, but it looks like a pretty damn appealing place to live. I mean, it's designed as a perfect community, and it tells you that there could be good Palestinian communities built on those other hills, dozens and dozens of them. It's going to require, obviously, water, but it's a symbol of hope. And so you go there and you see that, it makes a difference. I think in how you think about the reality. So I think a trip is, I prefer trips that aren't propagandistic, of which there are some. I like trips that allow multiple perspectives and encourage critical attitudes toward both cultures. But that makes a huge difference. Then you come back, I think you're a real emissary, and you can try to encourage people to think, more seriously and realistically about the issues. Then I think you need to think about, are there forms of political action that would actually be productive? And I think it is a simple fact that political action directed toward your own government is what people are most effective and realistic in doing. I think, rather than directing your action against Finland, you might want to direct it against Washington, D.C., that actually you have some responsibility for what this government does. I think that's forms of political action that I think are most realistic. But you get a chance to go there, the difference is huge. And as I said, I don't get how Judith Butler went there and thinks that the Israelis are going to just split, give it up. I don't see how you get that once you see the place. Israelis themselves, you'll never go to a country where everyone wants to have a discussion and a debate with you. You can't get in a taxi cab without debating Israeli government policy. So it's one of the easiest places to have an infinite number of conversations and meet people. And the Palestinians are also quite willing to talk through issues. Obviously, if the area is in flames, you can't wander over and wander through the West Bank. Obviously, conditions need to be relatively quiet before you do that. But there's actually there's no history of any violence against American tourists in the area. I mean, I think even Hamas realizes that violence against American tourists might be a little bit inconvenient for them in various respects. So, you don't carry the risks that Israelis do during times of high conflict. I've given you a couple months' work. And someone else, with another hand? Yeah.
Yeah, you just brought up Hamas quickly. What is, obviously BDS has some very vague in terms of what their goals are. What do the leaders of BDS say in terms of their support of Hamas, in terms of the support of a Palestinian state, things of that nature?
The key leaders tend to say that Hamas is a liberation movement. Butler says it's part of the international left. Barghouti says that its violence is justified given what Israel does. Butler insists on nonviolence, so she doesn't really, and she says when Hamas resorts to violence, it needs to be condemned because she thinks that it should be solved nonviolently. I agree it should be solved nonviolently, but that's going to have to be by way of negotiation, not by way of Israel simply abandoning its territory. But generally, BDS supported leaders are supportive of Hamas with qualifications. And I think, as I said in the talk, I do think that there are many Hamas advocates who would be willing to accept, peace if peace became real. All of Hamas leaders, no. I think Hamas's leadership is lost to the cause of peace. Hamas's charter really calls for the elimination of Israel, and it really is a genocidal charter. It calls for the elimination of Jews from the area by any means, including violence. And I think Hamas leadership, by and large, is committed to that charter. But just like all the BDS foot soldiers amongst American students, I don't think they're necessarily committed to all of BDS's aims or even know what the aims are. I mean, I doubt if, maybe some of you have read the July 2014 charter already and are familiar with the points I've raised, but no other American audience ever has, so, I kind of doubt it here. So I think there are Hamas supporters that are just ordinary people and could be moved toward good jobs, good homes, and so forth. What you do about the Hamas leadership that is really homicidal toward Israelis, I don't have a good answer to that question, but I think if the Palestinian people chose a negotiated solution, I think those Hamas leaders are going to have to face the wrath of their own people at some point. Because Hamas charter is not compatible with peace. It's a genocidal charter. So I think you can play that out and see that there's a likelihood of some necessary violence amongst Palestinian people themselves to settle with the Hamas leadership.
So you
Yeah.
said that you feel that one of the necessary steps is that Israel should stop building settlements on the West Bank.
Well, no, I said east of the security barrier actually carves a small percentage of West Bank territory and incorporates it within Israel.
Okay. And you also said that you don't see the likelihood of either Palestinian or Israeli leadership.
Current leadership.
Current leadership. So do you see a role for us in the United States to help create the right leadership or to help move the leadership toward meaningful, peaceful negotiations?
I'm not sure what that role would be. I mean, in the end, those two peoples need to choose their leaders. I think they're going to have to find it in their hearts and in their sense of necessity to make the kinds of political choices that will require. I think we can encourage our own government to take strong stands and to encourage policies that would move both sides toward peace. But to ask us to have an effect on the elective process in those two countries, not only do I think it's probably impossible, I think it would be massively unwelcome. Neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians like me to tell them what they should do. Any more than, America historically hasn't been eager to take lessons from other countries about what its policies should be. So there are limits to American power. There are limits to the effect that we can have. Now, I don't think that an American political movement can nominate a candidate for office in Israel. The Israelis are going to have to work that out themselves. Yeah, you were going to.
Yeah, I ask this especially for students who are active in student government and stuff. Is there a distinction that makes a difference between students active in BDS bringing a BDS academic boycott motion to a student government and students active in BDS bringing a divestment motion to a student government? The latter obviously avoids the whole academic freedom argument. But what are the proper responses to a movement for divestment, particularly divestment from the West Bank, which is something you might consider positive?
Right. I think, first of all, student government resolutions about divestment are routinely and universally ignored by boards of trustees and university administrations that actually set investment policy. And they see that as a pretty slippery slope indeed. They don't want students voting 1 year to divest from this. Next year they want to invest in some company that they like. They don't feel that either students or faculty have the capacity to make wise financial decisions. Looking at my history, I think that might be true for me. But I think, so first of all, they're just not going to listen to what you say. I mean, they have a legal responsibility, the Board of Trustees, the Board of Regents, whatever, they have a legal responsibility to manage their investments. They're going to do that no matter what you do. So the question then becomes, what's the symbolic value of that kind of resolution? And I think the symbolic value is small. Its purpose, the purpose of those debates, the purpose of a divestment resolution is not to get the university to divest from anything. The purpose is to win hearts and minds. It's the debates over that and the passions it generates that turn students either into supporters of Israel or opponents of Israel. The goal is to create advocates, and it ends up creating advocates who are passionately antagonistic to one another. So it doesn't help understanding, it doesn't help campus dialogue. In fact, those divestment resolutions go in the opposite direction. Now, I admit that the arguments about divestment resolutions as opposed to academic boycotts are different. With academic boycotts, you have this high principle that the purpose of the academy is to encourage dialogue, to encourage debate, to encourage interchange. And so you have an academic boycott violates the fundamental principle of what universities are here for. An economic boycott argument doesn't have that high principle basis for opposing it, but it does have practical consequences on campus that I think are counterproductive, and it has no impact on the Middle East whatsoever. I mean, no one over there really gives a damn whether you sell your Caterpillar stock or not, right? No one's lying awake at night worrying that you're going to sell your Caterpillar stock, including Caterpillar. So it serves no purpose. It also tends to demonize Israel as opposed to looking equally at both sides and asking what their strengths and limitations and what their incapacities to engage in dialogue are. Because I really believe the guilt for the failure to negotiate is shared. I think it's an equal opportunity failure to communicate, an equal opportunity failure to understand the other side, an equal opportunity failure to trust the other side, an equal opportunity failure to talk to the other side, goes on and on. So demonizing one side does not help that process. It doesn't do any good to the actual negotiating process. And it tends to create incredible controversy and antagonism on campus. As I watch these divestment debates unfold on various campuses on the United States, I see people yelling at one another. I see people, really becoming completely antagonistic, and I just would rather talk and learn and see what I can learn from other people and what kind of consensus can be found. So it does no good, but it does operate on different grounds. Yeah?
I guess to follow up on that, it seems to me what you said about the point of those divestment motions is not its practical effects, but rather publicity and many of the hearts and minds that it generates. I think that people who propose those motions would embrace that very statement, that it's about the arguments that ensue and the publicity that it generates. So having said that, if I'm thinking of UCLA, in which the Hillel group and the students supporting Israel, the group of students supporting Israel, chose a strategy of, in a sense, absenting themselves from that heated back and forth, right? And so my question is not so much about that strategy, but what do you think, given what you've just said, is the effective strategy when faced with the motion to divest?
Calm, rational discussion.
So engage but calm.
Refuse to yell. Refuse to castigate those who hold a different opinion. Refuse to question people's character. Refuse to question their motives. Refuse to define their identity for them. The list could go on, but yes, talk to them. So I would not have recommended that strategy. I think that simply loses the game. But I think if you answer anger with anger, nothing good comes of it. I think you can argue passionately without demonizing one another. You can advocate for your conviction for your beliefs with great conviction. You can craft language that's effective. You can try to persuade people. But if you demonize them and call their character into question, I think you just don't get anywhere that's productive. And refusing to talk at all, which is what happened there, I think absenting yourself from the debate doesn't accomplish anything. So, they're right to do what they choose to do, but I've been asked because I'm involved in a lot of organizational work, whether I think that strategy should be replicated, and I have a simple answer of no. Yeah.
I think a lot of the dialogue appropriately is on pressuring the parties and possibly punishing the parties in more appropriate versus less appropriate ways to push them towards, serious peace negotiations and resolving the conflict. I think often there's much to be said for that. On the other hand, you're dealing with two populations who very much see themselves as a victim, who are often motivated by fears rather than maliciousness or anything like that. And in that sense, that's also, I think, a difference between South Africa, where we have some racist, horrible ideology, and it's rather often, I think, fears and insecurities there are prompting populations to not be willing to take risks in peace negotiations. So given that, yes, you need pressure, but don't you also need reassurance, carrots, public diplomacy from Israelis to Palestinians in their media and vice versa, to actually break down those negative stereotypes and appeal to their fears and not just try to bang them overhead and punish them. And because from this conversation I hear, okay, this form of banging someone over the head is bad, but maybe we should bang them overhead in a nicer, more balanced way. And certainly maybe that is part of the conversation, but aren't we missing some of the other human emotions and fears and insecurities on both sides prompting this, that it's not merely pressure and punishment that maybe, on its own necessarily is the most constructive path either. I don't know.
As you formulated the odds that I would disagree with you seem to me minuscule. But I think, one of the things that I should have made clearer is that I think you have to offer people a viable alternative. Is you have to offer them something that they would choose rather than conflict. And I think, at least on the Palestinian side, that means economic and social opportunities. Believe me, when Rawabi is finally populated with its high-tech folks, they're not going to be storing weapons and heading out toward the border with Israel to shoot anybody. They're going to be designing software and earning some money, and they're going to be enjoying their lives. So I think you have to do much, much more to offer the Palestinians viable, rewarding lives. And that would draw people away from violence. And that means really substantial economic investment. But actually, it would be cheaper for Iran to finance construction and industrial development in Gaza than it would be to try to buy weapons and smuggle them. And weapons are actually expensive. That's one of the problems with them. And there's tremendous wealth amongst the key Arab states that can be used to build real opportunities for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And the U.S., by the way, has a little spare cash lying around that it's spending on things that might not be so vital to world peace. So that's, I think, as we've said, talking to you, efforts to build understanding, efforts to build a history of mutual relationships, and I think economic development that offers people lives, jobs and homes, and a real sense of belonging that many Palestinians don't have. The lives in the camps that have gone on for decades now are wretched and unacceptable. They should be given communities to live in and potential for employment. So I think decent lives would go a long way toward changing people's attitudes and actually making them willing to engage in better dialogue. If you're poor and you're suffering, and you see no future for your children, you're not filled with love for your fellow man and woman. And I think the combination of mutual understanding, building programs, with real economic development would offer a lot to the region. But yeah, because we start with talking about boycotts, there's a tendency to kind of find some alternative to them that accomplishes some of the same things. And I think that's the insight that you're offering, and it's a well-placed insight that that's not enough to talk that way. Even if it's not beating over heads, but something more felicitous than that. Yeah, right in the back there.
Yeah, so I've heard that some BDS proponents claim that the Jewish lobby, and especially like AIPAC and everything like that, is in the pockets of American politicians, and they're blindly supporting Israel, sending $3 billion of aid every year to Israel, and that BDS is like a civil resistance movement, and like that's the way that you're going to get your politicians to actually understand what we actually think and everything like that. So what would your response be to that? Right? That BDS is type of a revolutionary movement in terms of influencing politicians.
I think that's a little bit self-aggrandizing for the potential of the movement, that I think it might be overstating both its agenda and its aims. The influence of some Israeli organizations on American political life in Washington, D.C. is considerable. Its influence elsewhere is often relatively non-existent. Its political influence is not so great. But then every economic and political interest has, lobby groups in Washington, D.C. That's what half of the people in Washington, D.C. earn their money from, especially every ex-congressman and congresswoman earns their money from some lobby or another. So that whole city is just, is saturated with that kind of political life. And no power on earth is going to change it. Maybe the end of the world would bring it to the end, but that's just the way it's going to be. Given that, given the relationship between American politics and money, I just don't see some student BDS movements dramatically changing that, or in fact having any impact on Washington whatsoever. I think we have to work differently to change political policy in America, both at the local and the national level, by sort of looking to elect people who think about these issues in more subtle ways, looking to pressure your own representatives to think differently, doing all the kind of things that sometimes have been successful in changing government policy in the U.S. But I don't think trying to tell your university it should sell its Caterpillar stock is going to produce a sea change in Washington, D.C. The Jewish lobby conspiracy argument often has an anti-Semitic edge to it, particularly when it claims the effectiveness of that lobby elsewhere in the United States than in Washington, D.C., and on other kinds of decision-making. There's often no lobbying, there's often no pressure, and yet people attribute decisions to a Jewish lobby's power. That certainly happened in my own campus over the last couple of months. Jewish lobby has been accused of pressuring the Board of Trustees, and there's no evidence whatsoever that it happened. There's, to claim a Jewish lobby's influence when there's no evidence that it's actually doing anything, I'm afraid that has to be ascribed to prejudice and bias. Lobbies give money to politicians. They do specific visible things often that can be criticized. But simply to get it in your head that because a certain decision is made, it must have been the effect of a lobby, is I think not only paranoid but also prejudicial. So its impact is real, especially in Washington, D.C., like the impact of many lobbies, but it's not a worldwide conspiracy. You start thinking that way, or a national conspiracy, you're starting to think, I think, in anti-Semitic terms. I participated in a movement that I actually think did change American policy. That was the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. That was a mass movement. I was, tens of thousands of people would show up in Washington, D.C., commit civil disobedience. I had the pleasure one afternoon in Ohio of being in a small group that interrupted a speech by Lyndon Johnson, President of the U.S. I don't know if any of you recognize that name, Vijay. And was, there were only a dozen of us, but the Secret Service wasn't really dealing with providing the protections that it does now. So we were able to get into the crowd, get right in front of Johnson's podium, and then started to pull out our banners that we had under our jackets. And I was wrestled to the ground by a Secret Service agent who told me he'd like to get me behind bars and beat the shit out of me, which is a statement that I remember well. But on the larger scale, which I think we did have an impact on U.S. foreign policy, we did help get us out of Vietnam. The BDS movement isn't going to go there. You think you're going to have these faculty members and graduate students and undergraduates showing up in Washington, D.C. in the tens of thousands and committing civil disobedience over this issue? I mean, if you want a movement to have that kind of impact on American political life, it has to operate on that scale. The civil rights movement operated on that scale, and the civil rights movement had that kind of effect. I was there in Washington when Martin Luther King gave his famous speech. I was with a couple 100,000 people, mixed race. That was a mass movement. BDS just isn't going to get there. So if that's the fantasy, that it can have that kind of effect on American political life, well, you know, I got a bridge I want to sell you in Brooklyn, I got some swampland you might want to invest in Florida. You know, if you're that credulous, you know, I think maybe there's some other opportunities you might, alas, be vulnerable to. It's just, it's not going to reach enough people, no matter what happens, to build that kind of force. I've seen it twice. I've seen it with civil rights. I've seen it with the anti-war movement in Vietnam. This is not going to get there. Yeah.
Well, actually, she's been waiting for a while before me.
Oh, okay, she's sort of invisible to you.
Yeah, sorry. Hi. Thanks, by the way. So I was wondering, in light of the recent escalation in violence, and especially like the synagogue killing a couple days ago, do you think that BDS supporters, especially in America, will try to rationalize those and, you know, stick with the cause, or will we see a pullback from it in like Western society?
A rather than B. The BDS movement will try to rationalize it and say the violence is deplorable, but understandable in the light of what Palestinians are suffering. Obviously, people breaking into any religious institution, be it a mosque, be it a synagogue, and butchering people, does nothing except go down a road that directs us toward more violence. I'm very worried about what the Israeli government's response will be. All the good advice the government has had suggests that the policy of destroying the homes of relatives of perpetrators accomplishes nothing. It generates more antagonism. It doesn't prevent anything else from happening. On the other hand, what can Israel do? Basically, as far as we know, the perpetrators are both dead. So as criminals, they've had their punishment. The only issue that really remains is whether there were other people behind it. The people who went into that synagogue, the two men who went into the synagogue, knew they were going to their death. They knew that they could not get out of there alive. So what impelled them? What other relationships were they involved with? That might be a practical police issue if it turns out that there are other people involved. But the movement, I think, is going to just deplore it, but say it's understandable. And I think that's not really a very humane position to take. The violence on both sides that we've seen since June of this year has just been appalling. I mean, the thugs that abducted a Palestinian teenager and murdered him alive, that leaves an image of horror in that country. I think one of the things that Israel needs to do is provide better surveillance of its right wing. Unpopular for Netanyahu, obviously, but I think that kind of right-wing Israeli violence, just like Palestinian violence, needs to be overseen and, whenever possible, prevented from fulfilling itself. Israel has got to do a better job of policing its own right wing. The Palestinian Authority needs to do a better job of policing its radicals, because that kind of violence does, especially in such a small area, long-term horrific damage. It stays in people's minds and stays in their hearts for a long time. So I think it would be better if BDS found a better way of condemning it rather than rationalizing it. But I'm afraid I'm expecting the rationalizing, not the stronger condemnation. Certain more than pulling back. I don't think so. So now our generous deferral of this question to you gets to step forward.
Thanks. So, I guess I've received mixed messages from various people. I grew up in a community with a very strong...
I can't hear you too well.
Oh, sorry.
Stand up.
Yeah.
Project. Run for political office here and now.
All right. So I grew up in a very tight-knit Jewish community, very pro-Israelitis, and of course I am pro-Zionism. And growing up, I was always told that there is equal representation given to Palestinians and Arabs living in Israel with their positions in the Knesset. There's equal employment. However, coming here to campus has given me an opportunity to talk to people who believe to the contrary that are basically I've heard from several people who I consider to be intelligent, thoughtful, relatively moderate. The phrase that Palestinians and Arabs in Israel are second-class citizens, that they don't receive equal legal representation, that they don't receive equal employment opportunities, that their word is not taken. Their word is valued less over that of Israeli. I guess what's your view on the variability of that, and I guess to any degree that it might be true, what do you think I guess the solution would be socially?
Well, I think the first problem is that you can't generalize for all Israeli Arabs. If you go through various Israeli professions, you will find that some Arabs, Israeli Arabs, are quite successful in some professions. The key profession actually is the medical profession, where there are numerous Israeli Arab doctors, physicians, surgeons, administrators in hospitals. That's a profession where they obviously have equal status. They're department heads in hospitals, they have power. I mean, those Israeli Arabs who moved up in that profession, they're not suffering discrimination, they're suffering success, right? They have full lives. There are also Israeli Arabs that I think suffer real discrimination, particularly at the lower edge of the economic order. It's not exactly different in the United States. Those people who are in poorly paid professions don't always get such a good deal, right? I think also that Arab villages and small cities in Israel don't get equal public services, don't get equal infrastructure. There are some improvements, but the improvements are coming too slowly. But you can't pervasively say that all Israeli Arabs are second-class citizens. Some of them are first-class citizens. There is discrimination, and laws against it need to be enforced. They're not always enforced. As I've said, the Israeli Arabs that I've met simply want improvements in all these areas. They're not looking for boycotts of Israeli universities. They're looking for investment by the Israeli government in their lives to improve their lives. There is discrimination that needs to be eliminated, but it's obviously not universal. In higher education, there are universities with lots of Arab faculty members, Druze, Bedouin, range of Arab communities is fairly well represented amongst Israeli faculty and administrators. There are faculty members, there are department heads, and Israeli Arabs have a major role in a number of different Israeli universities. Certainly Ben Gurion University of the Negev, Haifa, because Haifa has the largest percentage of Arab students. There's a lot of significant Arab equality amongst faculty? Well, you could also say that neither Israeli or Arab faculty in Israel actually earn great salaries. So maybe all faculty members in Israel, Jews and Arabs alike are discriminated against, because they actually don't get these salaries that they would rather have. But at least it's it's not a racially or culturally differentiated, relatively lower wage. It's just the situation that faculty members have in Israel. It's not a lucrative career over there, right? It's not actually all that lucrative here for many people, but it has its compensations as it does there. There is real discrimination, but you need to look at the complexity and make differentiations, and try to see where improvements ought to be made. And definitely, what discrimination exists for Arab Israelis needs to be eliminated, and Israel needs to work at it much more industriously. They are making progress. The progress needs to be a lot faster. It needs to be a lot faster because discontent amongst Israeli Arabs presents a real danger to the Israeli state. It's 20% of the population, right? A significant portion of that 20% is unhappy. It speaks to inevitable social unrest. And beginning with the Second Intifada, we began to see just that. So it's in the interest of the Israeli majority to improve that situation faster. But there are really interesting things in Israel amongst the Arab population. As an English professor, I think I remember when I was still an English professor, not just a BDS debater. There are a number of Israeli Arab novelists who've chosen to write in Hebrew, which is, I think, really interesting. It's the majority language. They write their novels in Hebrew. If you go into Arab communities in Israel, you'll find that the children and their parents often celebrate Jewish holidays. It's just they replace all the Jewish part with Arab culture, right? So, the holidays mean something quite different to them. But since the banks are closed and so forth, they make it their holidays. They just totally transform it. So there are real intersections and mutual transformations of Arab and Israeli culture that I think are quite interesting and productive. Arabs have changed their lives in Israel to adapt to the country and make themselves successful. Believe me, I don't think there's a single Arab novelist writing in Hebrew who wants to see Israel turned into an Arab-dominated country, because their Hebrew novels wouldn't have much of a sales potential at that point. I mean, they've made a choice to commit themselves to that culture. I've talked to a couple of them. They're pretty interesting. Some of the novels have been translated. So there are these cultural areas where Arab-Israeli culture has become something quite different than you might imagine if you're thinking about it from this distance, right? You can't characterize the doctors or the writers as oppressed or second-class citizens. Someone's publishing your novels and selling them, and you're earning a living that way, you have a family, right? It's quite different. So it's a very mixed picture. And the mixed picture is worth learning about because it's really interesting. There are things, I was surprised to learn that there are Arab writers in Israel who write in Hebrew rather than Arabic. I just wouldn't have imagined that before I learned a bit more about it. Yeah.
That's an interesting answer to that question. Are there, like is there still the lower class that has been created, the Palestinians, that says, like, what I heard was like, well, some Palestinians are doing fine.
I'm sorry, some Palestinians what?
Are doing fine. Right? And it doesn't seem to, I just thought that was interesting, like that there's that there is a power dynamic there, and I wonder if you can address this, that Israel and Palestine, there's deplorable things happening on both sides, but Israel has a lot more money and it has a lot more global influence from like America. Palestine has the support of some of its neighbors and stuff, but like there's still there's this dynamic that makes it not so simple as they should just sit down and talk about it. You know, in any situation in the United States, okay, here it is. To say that that Israel needs to do more to help them and to like rise them up the chain and to increase their social mobility seems to be just as much in this like fictional la la land that you're talking about as as I agree with Judith Butler's statements, for example, are that they would just willingly do that. That's a very complex and difficult process, and we're not even achieve that for our African American population. And that's something that after 50 years, we continue to, a disproportionate number of our African American population is still in the lower class of society. So to say it's that simple.
Disproportionate number of them are in jail.
Yes, and so to say it's that simple seems suspect to me. That that is I don't know if BDS is the answer, but I guess of course Israel needs it. That should be imperative. But they're not. History shows, I think, that most countries don't do that. Willing. That's a hard thing to do, and not that I don't know. Speaking of faith in their leaders, I guess but this is not something that our attendance to do.
Well, I think that's a fair critique. What I offer in qualification of it is that if Israel doesn't do it, Israel is going to be facing serious resistance from its Arab citizens, and it's going to be facing violent unrest. It's seen some hints of that already. So what we're talking about, from my perspective, is cold self-interest on behalf of the Israeli power structure. I'm not necessarily looking for spectacular humanity and generosity. I'm looking for self-interest as a motivation for making greater and more rapid changes in the Arab communities in Israel. I mean, they have been doing many things, and some professions have been successfully opened to equal participation by Arabs. And Israeli higher education is actually doing a pretty good job of making itself available to Arab citizens and offering remedial programs sometimes when they are necessary. There are a number of those to bring students in. Self-interest is always the coldest way to present those necessities. And I think, it has potential to succeed. I think Israel was really frightened when, for the first time, there was Israeli-Arab participation in the violence of the Second Intifada. That may be the most significant thing about the Second Intifada for Israel, is that some of its Arab citizens participated. It did not happen in the First Intifada. That was like a warning signal, and it helped produce some changes. And I think more of those changes will come. But prejudice is hard to overcome, and all the surrounding violence makes it still harder. But any Israeli politician worth his or her salt can understand that Israel's security as a country depends upon bettering the conditions of Israeli Arab citizens. It's a security necessity, and I have some hope for it because of that. If it was just human generosity, less hope. But they need to do it for their own well-being. Yeah, I'm back.
What do you think the future is?
I can't hear you at all.
What is the future of the BDS movement? Do you think their lack of success will just cause them to phase out?
Do I think what?
Their lack of success will cause them to phase out.
I've been dealing with these people for 8 years. I mean, it was a smaller movement, but I was opposing it 8 years ago, and its leaders are ferocious. Its leaders in the United States have made BDS the center of their political and intellectual lives. Short of heart attacks, auto accidents, or exposure to fatal disease, nothing is stopping them. So the energy of the leaders will continue unabated. The issue is what kind of outreach the movement has to ordinary students and faculty who aren't decided about these things, aren't yet well informed, don't yet know what to think. And I think there the future of that battle is uncertain. I don't know where it will go. But I think the movement itself, at least as a movement directed by a certain number of prominent advocates, will survive until they retire from active life. And I just don't see them lessening their passion. I mean, some of the people in the Modern Language Association and I have been debating this for 8 years, right? It's sort of a long, bloody time. And I don't see them standing down. They're going to keep reaching out to people. And I think BDS is going to have some real successes on American campuses over the next couple of years. After that, there's a fundamental truth that is hard for us to accept, which is that we do not know what's going to happen a few years down the road. History is not predictable. Where in the world is it less predictable than in the Middle East? Did you hear anybody talking about the rise of ISIS 2 years ago, predicting it? I didn't hear a single human being suggesting that that would happen. And you can go through the Middle East and look at developments, and it's a very unpredictable part of the world. And therefore, BDS's potential always depends upon real events in the Middle East, right? They stimulate, just as the war in Gaza in July generated a lot of BDS activism in the United States. 10 months ago, I wasn't predicting Gaza. Who was, right? So if this is a movement in the United States that is somewhat dependent upon political developments on the other side of the world. And I think that makes it impossible to predict with confidence what its development will be. If peace broke out in the Middle East, I'm not holding my breath, then I think BDS would not clearly have a place to go. And I think the large number of students and faculty who are interested in it would cease to be interested in it. I think, David Lloyd in California, and Omar Barghouti on the lecture circuit ain't going to give up soon because that's their life. Yeah. It's you.
Oh, you answered the question.
I try to anticipate them answering as much as possible. But
You answered the great question.
Yeah.
I wanted to respond a little bit also to the last kind of set of conversations, and I think it fits the title of your talk about the bait and switch. How we move from talking about are there second-class citizens in Israel, and the discussion of yes, there's social and economic discrimination, but the BDS movement kind of relies on that idea that there are second-class citizens in Israel, that many Palestinians are disadvantaged culturally and economically from that kind of discrimination, to then in charge of apartheid or Jim Crow, right, which was also kind of raised earlier. And to me, I think that's, speaks to what you're talking about in terms of education, is that to me there's a huge difference between saying there is racism, there's discrimination, people are disadvantaged on the basis of race in Israel proper, to saying by law there are different classes of citizens, and that's apartheid and Jim Crow. And BDS kind of relies on us taking one and thinking of it as the other. And you kind of saw it here. So I think in answer to kind of what you were saying, if BDS just said, you know what, in Israel there's social and economic discrimination against Palestinians, much like in the United States. We need to boycott Israel because of that. They wouldn't get very far. The language of apartheid and Jim Crow is meant to raise the bar and say there's something exceptional going on there. It's not just like in the United States, it's above and beyond the United States. Because unless they're going to turn around and say, well, actually there's apartheid in Israel and there's apartheid in the United States. And some maybe in private conversation would say that, but that's not part of a general political rhetoric. You don't see the same call to action within the United States as you would have toward Israel in the BDS movement. And so I think that's a good example of the bait and switch, is to take one and and turn it into something that, in terms of law, is quite different. And to me, that's all the difference in the world, because social and economic discrimination in a country where it's not enshrined in law, like Jim Crow and apartheid, means that, as difficult as it might be, you can work within that system to rectify the problem. And it's difficult work, and it's not like combating racism in the United States. It's not easy, but it is incredibly important. But that's very different from saying the entire legal structure has to be changed.
Yeah, and Israel itself, within its borders, not including the West Bank, is not an apartheid state. It's not a state that legally gives Arabs second-class status. So there's just no validity, as you say, to escalate discrimination in Israel to a legal system that doesn't exist, that gives people second-class status. Israeli Arabs have full citizenship. They don't get as many good deals as other Israelis do that have full citizenships. The issue is with the West Bank, where I think there is a danger of it becoming something like an apartheid state. That's, I think, a real risk for Israel in the West Bank, and it's what I think poses a risk to Israel's soul, if I can use a phrase that Stephen Salida says I'm not supposed to use because Israel doesn't have one, but I think it poses a risk to its national character. So you have to, the first thing you have to do is take those two blocks of land and separate them and recognize that the realities on the two are very different. I like Peter Beinart's phrase that there's democratic Israel over here and there's undemocratic Israel over there. It's got a simple distinction, but I think it has some validity. I'm trying to think someone who hasn't.
I have.
Go ahead. You've been trying for a while.
Well, I've heard different conversations about the relationship between the Arabs, the Palestinians, and the Ethiopian population. Can you speak a little bit about that? One of the conversations I heard was that the Ethiopian population was grafted into the IDF, and that they become spokesmen.
What did you say? They were
drafted into the IDF, and they've established careers, and they've become spokesmen. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
I talked for an afternoon with one Ethiopian Israeli, a very interesting, very smart woman, who both talked about opportunities. I mean, she has an advanced degree. She's a spokesperson for a non-government organization. She's really, made her way in Israeli society. But many Ethiopian Jews have not. Many are, again, the subject of discrimination. Certainly the Army has offered one career for them. All Israelis have to serve in the Army, excepting certain religious Israelis that don't, but I'm not sure how much longer that's going to last.
Excepting the Arab,
what?
Excepting the Arab Israeli citizens who are actually not allowed to serve.
Well, the Jews...
The Druze are, and the Bedouins are distinction there. The Arab Palestinians, Israeli Palestinians are not allowed to serve.
Well, it's not true.
They're not allowed to serve. But that's not
the case.
There's something there.
Some do, most don't want to. They're allowed to.
Yes, that's exactly that. And there's something that is really important to mention throughout this entire discussion is that there is Arab Israelis, and they are the one with the citizenship, and there are the Palestinians. As far as the second point, Arab Israelis, they serve the same benefits that any other Israeli. Regarding the Palestinians that we talk, unfortunately, they are not part of the responsibility on the day-to-day basis, especially education level and career opportunities under the Israel government. Arab Israelis sometimes also because of their culture don't really like to progress more because they are more of a family patriarchal culture as well. So there's also a lot of cultural distinction we can talk about. So the generalization about second-class citizen is very, for me, it's just not entirely true, or not too entirely dismissed because, listen, I know Israel is not perfect, and we do, there is racism in the community itself, not gonna lie, but the generalization of they have no chances at all are 100% not true. And especially in the army, by the way, Ethiopian as well, and learn about more trouble in the Army, you're more than welcome to talk to me because that's what I did in the Army. But that's but like it's just discussions.
One of the reasons Israel faces more unrest in the Palestinian territories is that enough universities have been established there at the educational level of Israeli Palestinians on the West Bank is significantly higher than the educational level in most Arab countries. And when you get educated, you can become a more articulate protester and a more articulate political agent. So one of the ironies is that Israel faces more discontent on the West Bank because of the educational opportunities that have been created for Palestinians, which are actually quite a bit better than they are in Arab countries. So it's not perfect, and I must say that that academic freedom is not alive and well in Palestinian universities. There's a lot of pressure for conformity, and the pressure for conformity is more violent and threatening than it is in Israel itself, which also has some pressure for conformity in its universities. But there's more academic freedom in Israel than there is amongst Palestinian universities on the West Bank. And I wouldn't even attempt to evaluate the one university in Gaza at this point. It's sort of beyond my conceptualization what the reality there is.
Well, thank you. Oh, one more.
Earlier you mentioned...
you're going to have to speak louder. There's some kind of a thing here, a fan or something.
I don't know what that is. It's very annoying.
It blocks out half of my hearing. So
earlier you mentioned that you didn't think
Why don't you come up a little bit?
Earlier you mentioned that you didn't think that Washington could really change its policies with like the Jewish lobby. And that's
No, I didn't mean to say that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, it just seemed like you were saying that there wasn't going to be any major change from student organizations because of lobbying in Washington. Do you think that if there were some form of campaign finance reform, then we could exert more pressure on Washington to change policies related to Israel?
I didn't want to say that Washington policies were unchangeable because of lobbying in Washington. I just said that that's a pervasive feature of American political life, and all sorts of lobbies have a lot of influence in Washington. I think, for one thing, that the position of major Jewish organizations has begun to change over the last few years. Even IPAC is willing, which has been pretty right-wing, is actually willing to tolerate criticism of Israeli policy in a way that it wouldn't have even 2 or 3 years ago. So I think the perception of life on the West Bank has begun to change. Even the most stalwart of Israeli-supportive organizations in the United States, they're beginning to change their attitudes because I think the attitudes of the Jewish community in the United States is evolving. It's not, it's not carved in stone. So the lobbying that goes on is itself going to change because those Jewish communities' perceptions are changing nationwide, and that can help facilitate changes in U.S. policy. I think working on political campaigns in your own state, in your own district, arguing with politicians, trying to get them to listen, can have an impact. I don't think that the power of the lobbies is absolute, but it's also important to know that the organizations that do lobbying are not unchanging. They themselves are slowly changing the way they think about the realities of the West Bank. There's a lot more awareness of the fact that West Bank life is not necessarily a lot of fun. I think protests on the West Bank have helped generate that kind of awareness, and that changes attitudes and policies back here eventually. That's it.